Hello, and welcome to the Mind Report. My name is Jonathan Phillips, and I am from Yale University's Departments of Philosophy and Psychology. And I'm really excited to be talking with Liane Young today about the work that she's been doing in moral psychology. So, hi, Liane.
Hi, Jonathan.
So, Liane, let me quickly introduce you. So, you're a professor, a new professor at Boston College. And then previous to that, you did a postdoc with Rebecca Sachs, a neuroscientist at MIT. And you also got your PhD in psychology from Harvard University.
Yep, that's right.
Great. So Liane has really become one of the leading figures in research on moral psychology. So it's really exciting to have her here on the Mind Report with us today.
Thanks, Jonathan. That's really sweet of you.
Yeah. So Liane, a lot of your research is focused on how different cognitive processes play a role in the moral judgments that we make. So I thought maybe today we could take a closer look at some of the roles that some specific cognitive processes, say like theory of mind, or ability to reason about other agents and their intentions and beliefs and desires, play in the moral judgments you make. And then we can sort of step back and pull all that back together. But then I also started thinking that maybe it'd be fun to start with just hearing how you got interested in moral psychology.
Sure, yeah. So I actually started out in philosophy, like you, as an undergrad. I was a philosophy major studying moral philosophy with Professor Francis Kam over at the Kennedy School at Harvard, and what we did pretty much all day was come up with moral dilemmas and our intuitions about those dilemmas, which would then serve as the groundwork for moral principles and theories that were supposed to dictate how people ought to make judgments about what kinds of harms are permissible, when it's permissible to kill one person to save 5 people, when it's permissible to intentionally cause harm to people, and so on. And I became really interested in where these intuitions come from, whether these intuitions are grounded in conscious principled reasoning, whether these intuitions are grounded in emotions, to what extent are we biased when we generate these intuitions, do we share these intuitions with other people, do philosophers have particularly weird intuitions, and so on.
So there are lots of questions.
What's that? Do philosophers have weird intuitions?
Yeah, well, they probably do. But you seems like you got plenty of questions out of Francis Kam's class.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So, I mean, it was a great experience working with Francis and sort of applying this intuitionist method to moral philosophy, but again, just made me wonder about the biological origins of these intuitions. And from there, I started doing some work in psychology, some survey research, seeing to what extent are some of these intuitions about moral dilemmas universal, to what extent are they mediated by demographic and cultural differences, and so on.
Oh, great. So one of the things you've done a lot of work on is the role of intention in moral psychology. And so I wondered if maybe a good place to start was just by thinking more philosophically or more generally the role that intentions might play in our moral judgments. And then from there we can sort of go into the research that you've done yourself.
Yeah. So I guess the beginning there was in philosophy also. So starting with the trolley problem in philosophy, which you're all too familiar with, but I'll just rehearse for others.
Yeah.
So in the trolley problem in philosophy, the sort of broad question is, one, is it permissible to harm one person to save many, to maximize aggregate welfare? And in one case, the question is whether it's morally permissible to turn a trolley away from 5 people, it's about to hit and kill 5 people, and onto a sidetrack where it would hit and kill 1 person instead. And there most people have the intuition that it's permissible to turn the trolley away from 5 people and onto 1 person instead. But then when this trolley scenario is modified such that the question is now, would you push a man off of a bridge so that his body stops an oncoming trolley from hitting 5 people further down the track? Most people have the intuition that it's just absolutely not okay, not morally permissible to push the man off the bridge to save the 5 people, even though the numbers are the same, and so on. And so this was one of the initial problems that I was introduced to in moral philosophy, and working with Francis Cam, became sort of exposed to a whole body of work suggesting that it's the factor of intention that differentiates these two cases. So in one case, the harm that you cause to the one person is merely a foreseen side effect of your action. It'd be great if the one guy weren't on the sidetrack, you would turn the trolley anyway, saving those 5 people. But if the one man weren't there on the bridge, you wouldn't be able to use his body to stop the trolley from hitting those 5 people. And so in a really important sense, you intend to harm the man on the bridge, in that you use his body as a necessary means to your end of saving those 5 people. And so I became really interested in this distinction between intended harm and foreseen harm, and started looking to see whether we could find signatures of this difference in the brain. So that was actually my first fMRI experiment, which totally failed. And I think that there are probably a number of reasons why that experiment failed. But among those reasons might have just been the fact that this is such a subtle difference in intent, the difference between intended harm and foreseen harm. After all, you are intentionally causing harm in both cases. You know what you're doing. You know that your action is going to kill 1 and save 5. And that's an argument that utilitarian philosophers use as well to argue that there is no difference between these two cases because, you know, your eyes are wide open. You know that you're about to kill 1 person to save 5 people. And it's the numbers that matter. And so from there, I began to look at sort of the role of intent in a much less subtle way. So the difference between intentional harm and accidental harm, where in one case you don't know that you're about to harm 1 person or to kill 1 person, and in the other case you do. And that really does make a big difference in people's moral judgments.
Right. So the thought was that you sort of got started with these philosophical questions about the trolley problem. And there then one way that you can make sense of the trolley problem, or make sense of the intuitions that we have about the trolley problem, that it is okay to pull a lever to save 5 people by killing 1, but it's not okay to push a man off the bridge, is that we can appeal to the role of intention. So you'd have to have the intent in one case to sort of kill the man to save the 5, whereas the other case it seems more like a side effect.
That's right. Yeah, that's right.
Good. So and then from there you said, well, maybe that difference is a little too subtle to pick up with our current fMRI machines.
Right.
So you started looking at cases where it's fully, you do intend it, and in cases where you fully don't intend it. But in both cases, maybe a bad outcome occurs, or maybe a good outcome could occur.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. So I should say that part of the rationale for looking at neural signatures of intention is that, as you know, it's widely contested as to what actually does make the difference between the first trolley case and the second trolley case, where the guy is on the bridge. And a lot of psychologists suggest that we can't simply introspect on our own psychological processes. We don't have access to the principles that actually drive our judgments in these cases. So it could be intention, but it could be emotion, and it could be a whole number of other factors. And so one of the unique contributions of brain imaging here would have been that we have some sense of where processing of mental states like intentions happens in the brain, so we can see whether we can pick up any of that signature and whether that differentiates these cases of intended and foreseen harm, or rather is it in fact something else like emotional differences.
Good. Okay, good. So then how do you measure the role of theory of mind or a role of intention in moral judgment using neuroscience?
Yeah, so this is a lot of the work that my advisor, Rebecca Sachs, pioneered, looking at the role of a particular brain region, the right temporoparietal junction, which is a part of your brain that's right above and behind your right ear. And it turns out that this brain region is highly selective for mental state information, like thinking about other people's thoughts, their beliefs, intentions, desires, and so on. And in other studies that Rebecca and her colleagues have done, this region is responsive to mental states, but not responsive to other information that might be socially relevant, like physical appearance or whether somebody's hungry or tired, internal subjective sensations, and so on. And so we were really able to build on that prior work to see what is this region doing when people are making moral judgments, and is this brain region being robustly recruited to process people's intentions when people are making moral judgments of other people's actions.
Good. So then, I know that one of the cases you've used to look at the role of intentions have been, say, like accidental harms that are some harm that's brought about accidentally. Or you can also have something like failed attempts at harm. So what do you see, or what does RTPJ show when you give people cases like that?
Well, perhaps unsurprisingly, the RTPJ is recruited when people are making judgments of accidents and attempts. And just to give some examples of accidents and attempts, one of the cases that we use, which is pretty easy for our subjects to understand, is one in which a character, somebody named Grace, has a false belief about a situation. So she thinks that she's about to spoon some sugar into her friend's coffee, and it turns out that somebody has swapped the sugar with a poison, and so she ends up putting poison into her friend's coffee and instead killing her friend, which is, of course, a bad thing.
Yeah.
And then you could imagine the other case where this time Grace has a malicious intent. She wants to poison her friend. She thinks that the white powdery substance that she's putting into her friend's coffee is toxic poison, but it turns out that somebody swapped the poison and the sugar, and she's actually just putting sweetener into her friend's coffee. So that would be a case of failed attempt to harm. Mm-hmm. And most people have the intuition that for both of these cases, intentions matter a whole lot. And that's indeed the case. Intentions matter quite a lot. And if you sort of pit these two cases against each other, it turns out that intentions may matter even more than the information about the outcome. So whether somebody died or just had their coffee sweetened. So typically people say
Right.
that attempted harms are much worse than accidents on the basis of intentions.
Right.
So RTPJ is recruited when people are making moral judgments of these kinds of scenarios. And more recently, what we've found is that the activity in this region is correlated with the moral judgments that people make, in particular, of accidental harms. So the case where you think that you're putting sugar into your friend's coffee, but it turns out to be poison.
I see. So you get, in the case where you are trying to put sugar into your friend's coffee, it turns out to be poison. So I'm reading that case, and then I have a lot of activation in RTPJ, and basically your thought as to what's going on in that case is that I'm really considering her mental states. I'm considering the fact that she really didn't intend the bad outcome, and then I'm more likely to forgive her. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. That's right. So the sort of magnitude of response in the RTPJ reflects the extent to which you are considering the fact that the person in the story had a false belief, that she didn't mean to do it, that she had an innocent intention, and she should be let off the hook for the accident.
Right. Okay, good. And then, so there's some populations of people who actually are either born or acquire a deficit in theory of mind ability, or to the extent to which they're able to think about other people's mental states. So do you find the same sorts of effects with those people?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So recently, in collaboration with Joe Moran over at Harvard, we looked at a population of very high-functioning individuals with autism spectrum disorders, and autism is characterized by impairments in social interaction, including social cognition and thinking about other people's mental states, like people's intentions, which is important for moral judgment, as we've just discussed. And so the prediction going into that study was that individuals with autism would show different moral judgments, not because they have deficits in moral reasoning on the whole, but rather that moral reasoning depends on mental state reasoning, and due to their deficits in mental state reasoning, their moral judgments might look different. And so what we found was that individuals with autism were harsher on accidental harms. In other words, they were more likely to make moral judgments based on the fact that somebody died, the fact that somebody got hurt, the bad outcome, as opposed to what somebody did or didn't mean to do, like the fact that somebody didn't actually mean to poison their friend.
Right. Right. So, I mean, it seems interesting. I mean, so now there's this population of people that seem to be going around not forgiving anyone for any of the accidents that they cause. I mean, do you think that something like that actually has an effect on their life?
That's a really interesting question. I think that autism spectrum disorders are, of course, very, very complicated. So there are probably lots of different factors that contribute to difficulties in social interaction, but surely being able to forgive the people around us for the sort of many trivial or non-trivial things that they do to us is really important for maintaining smooth social interactions and smooth relationships. So it's a good question as to how that impacts people's everyday lives.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess it's a hard question. I mean, I'm sure there are lots of difficulties there, so it may be difficult to pull that apart from all the other things that are going on.
Yeah, I think so.
So there are two things you might think that are happening. So one thing is that you're more forgiving of accidental harms, but you also might think that the extent to which you consider someone's mental state, which should make you more condemn some failed attempt at bringing about harm. So do you find evidence for that in using these sorts of studies?
In populations of people with autism?
Sure, yeah.
We don't actually. So the effect is asymmetric, and it's asymmetric in young children too. So I should mention some other developmental work has shown that young children also find it very hard to let people off the hook for accidental harms. And it's not until they're older, say around 7 years old, that they're able to forgive people for causing harms accidentally by taking mental state information into account rather than focusing their moral judgments just based on a bad or harmful outcome. Right. And I think there are a number of reasons for the difference between the judgments that we make about accidents and the judgments that we make about failed attempts to harm. So one possibility is that both in young children and also in individuals with autism, the prepotent response in the case of an accident may be the response to the bad outcome. The outcome is sort of the salient feature of the situation that somebody got hurt. And it may take a particularly robust representation of the agent's mental state, their false belief, their innocent intention, to be able to override maybe an emotional response to the bad outcome in that case. And so for many of us, even though we typically forgive accidents, it still may require a little bit of effort to override an initial response to the fact that, somebody erased my hard drive, even though it was by accident, in order to, go with the mental state-based moral judgment. And so I think accidents pose a little bit more of a challenge than attempted harms in that respect. So that's the first possibility. And then the second, which is totally compatible with that, is just that in the case of an attempted harm, like say attempted murder or something like that, what's really salient there is not just false belief information, the fact that, right. I thought it was poison, even though it was actually sugar. But as a reader of that scenario, I might immediately infer from that information about the agent's belief to some, information about that person's goal or desire, like they
right.
wanted to kill
or
someone.
Character.
Yeah, exactly. And it turns out that young children are better able to reason about goals and desires and sooner before they're able to reason about representational mental states like false beliefs or ignorance and so on. And so for that right. reason, too, making a negative moral judgment of attempted harm may be easier than making a positive moral judgment of accidental harm.
Right. So in all the cases we've been talking about so far, you basically are looking at this sort of correlational data. So you can measure someone's RTPJ activation, or say their ability to reason about other people's false beliefs. And then you can look at their moral judgments, and then you can see this really a fascinating relationship. But I mean, one of the most exciting things I think about the work that you've done is that you've actually been able to get at this question more causally. So I was wondering if you could talk about that.
Yeah, so we were fortunate to be able to use a technology called transcranial magnetic stimulation, or TMS, which allows us to temporarily modulate activity in specific brain regions with just the right resolution. And we're also lucky in that the right temporal junction is close to the surface of the brain, so we're able to target that region using TMS, transcranial magnetic stimulation. And so we were able to use TMS to transiently disrupt activity in this region and then look at the effect of that disruption on people's moral judgments, and in particular, people's moral judgments of these same kinds of scenarios that we've been talking about: attempted harms, accidental harms, and so on.
Right. So it's basically like you're creating a temporary patient population. Is that?
Yeah. Right. So it's been TMS has been said to cause virtual lesions. Right. They're virtual because
And have
they
you
don't
done it on
actually
yourself?
exist. Yes, I have. I've been a subject in many a TMS experiment, and I actually used to demonstrate on myself too, as subjects would come in just to show them that it was okay.
Wow. So when did you? And presumably you. I mean, maybe you didn't do this, but do you think? I mean, if you read a case, say some moral scenario in which someone accidentally brought about some harm, and during the time you were TMSing RTPJ, So, well, maybe at first it's helpful to start out with just saying, well, so what happens when you do TMS or TPJ? And then we can talk about your own experience when that happened.
I should say I've never run myself through my own experiment, so that would be something new and different. But when we applied TMS to subjects or TPJs and then compared those subjects' moral judgments to their moral judgments when we applied TMS to a different brain region that had, presumably nothing to do with mental state reasoning, we saw that we saw a reduction in the role of mental states, beliefs, and intentions in the moral judgments that they made of these kinds of scenarios. So just to give you an example, again, in the case where I think that the powder is poison, even though it's just sugar, and I spoon some into your coffee, if your RTPJ has been temporarily disrupted, then you're more likely to say that that is perfectly permissible. I shouldn't actually say perfectly permissible. So the effects that we saw were around a point on a 7-point scale, which is a modest effect.
The mean still suggests that they think that it's wrong to do that sort of.
That's right. That's right. They still think it's very wrong, but looking at the difference is a reliable and significant difference compared to their own judgments when their TPJ is fully online.
Right. That's so in a sense you're really able to change people's moral judgments just using the new tools of neuroscience.
Yeah, I mean, in one sense, it's kind of crazy that we're able to use this technique to modulate people's moral judgments in this systematic and predictable way. Again, it's systematic and predictable, so we might have already thought without this technology that this brain region is recruited, it's activated when people are making these kinds of moral judgments. Its activity seems to track with the kinds of moral judgments that people make, and this was sort of the last piece of that particular puzzle there. So that's interesting. But on the other hand, I guess what's interesting to me about people's reactions to these data is that social psychologists have been manipulating people's, not just people's moral judgments, but their moral behaviors for decades upon decades.
Right.
I mean, the first moral psychologists were the social psychologists, Stanley Milgram, who just by, sitting people down and, instructing an experimenter to tell people to deliver electric shocks to other subjects, people did that. And to me, that's actually much more compelling than changing people's moral judgments of accidental harms.
And probably much easier to do it, and it costs much less money.
Yeah, right. Or spraying the room with a foul smell, that has similar effects on people's moral judgments. there are all sorts of things that one can do to change people's moral behavior and change people's moral judgments, it turns out.
Right, right. So it seems like really the exciting thing about using TMS, well, I mean, it sounds pretty strange to be able to change people's moral judgments just by using some sort of neuroscience method, is that it was really able to get to this sort of causal question between the role that intentions are playing in the moral judgments.
Yeah, I think so. And I think that part of what the TMS results illustrate is that one can kind of go in and systematically disrupt one aspect of people's moral judgments while leaving the rest of it intact, right? So we didn't disrupt people's moral judgments wholesale. People are still able to base moral judgments on outcome information and causal information. It's specifically the ability to think robustly about people's intentions that got disrupted. Right.
Okay, so we talked a little bit about the role of intention, but another thing I know that you have studied is the role of motion in people's moral judgments. So I was wondering if we'll try to cover that one too.
Yeah, so earlier I had mentioned the case of an accident where even you and I with, intact brains, and hopefully we're at the mature state as far as moral judgment goes, yeah, right. Might go a little bit crazy if somebody sent us a computer virus by accident, right? That wiped out our computer. And part of the reason why we might, take a little while to forgive and forget would be our initial response to the bad outcome, the fact that something bad happened to us. And, this doesn't have to be these stories don't have to feature ourselves as the victims. We could imagine hearing a story about, a friend whose dog got run over by the neighbor and it was a total accident, but still it's a real tragedy, and we respond intuitively and emotionally to the fact that, the dog got run over or the computer got erased and so on. And so the theory was that prepotent response needs to be inhibited before we can offer forgiveness. And what if we were to test a population of people where that emotional response was reduced or absent? And the prediction there would be that those people would deliver almost hyper-rational moral judgments that were based almost completely on the intent information. Right. Mm-hmm. So what we did was we looked at prison inmates in Wisconsin who either were diagnosed, who had a clinical diagnosis of psychopathy, or who didn't. So the control subjects were other prison inmates without a diagnosis of psychopathy.
And the thought there is that the psychopaths in particular have some sort of deficit in their sort of emotional processing with regards to other people.
Yeah, exactly. So that this is a population of people who might have a blunted emotional response to the pain and suffering of other people, the pain and suffering of victims, including victims of accidents.
Right.
So this was just a paper and pencil test administered at the prison where, again, they read the same kinds of scenarios that we've been discussing where we vary these dimensions of outcome and intention. Somebody has a good intention but causes a bad outcome, producing an accident. And as predicted, what we found was that those participants with a diagnosis of psychopathy were more likely to judge accidents as morally permissible, as okay. So they did offer those hyper-rational, intent-based moral judgments, and we think the reason for that is due to their diminished emotional response to the bad outcome of the accident.
Right, yeah, that's interesting. Because you might think that another emotional response you might have is that you would have an emotional response to the bad outcome occurring.
Right, so these individuals do not show the emotional response to that outcome, and therefore they're able to forgive the accident. Yeah. So there are people. You can test people that have
now that they're adults or they've gone to prison, they've been given a test for psychopathy, and they've marked high enough such that they're considered psychopaths. But there are also people who are born psychopaths, presumably. Do you expect that there would be differences between those people?
That's a really good question. I'm not a psychopathy expert, but I know that there are many different theories about the different subtypes of psychopathy. Similar debates are had with respect to lesion patients, so early onset versus late onset lesion patients. And I know that many interesting differences have been documented there, suggesting that early learning matters a whole lot when it comes to moral cognition. So I suspect that there might be similar differences in the case of psychopathy,
Right.
but I hesitate to speculate until the evidence comes out.
There are probably a harder population to study as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
One other question you might have, so with the intention, the role of intentions in moral judgment, you were able to look at the sort of causal relationship there by using something like TMS, and it might be hard, obviously, to TMS, the part of the brain that's going to be involved with the emotional response you would have in those cases. But you might think that you could actually induce some sort of emotional response. So is there any work that's shown that you can actually induce emotional response, and then that will change people's moral judgments?
That's interesting. Not for these kinds of cases, although I guess you could imagine that if you juiced up people's emotional responses to particularly salient outcomes, that they might find it more difficult to forgive accidents due to a difficulty inhibiting emotional responses to the bad outcome there. But there's certainly lots and lots of interesting work on inducing disgust responses in people and looking at the impact of those manipulations on people's moral judgments. So crazy experiments by Talia Wheatley and John Haidt hypnotizing subjects to experience a flash of revulsion at arbitrary words, and then showing that people make harsher moral judgments when they're induced to experience incidental disgust. And then other studies, Carlo Valdesolo and Dave DeSteno, showing that when you reduce those feelings of disgust by showing people comedic skits of Saturday Night Live, that you get people to judge moral scenarios as more permissible. So there's certainly lots and lots of interesting work on inducing emotions, incidental emotions like disgust in particular, but also some neat work looking at anger.
Right. So it also seems like
judgments.
that you don't even have to do anything as special as hypnotizing someone if you want to induce disgust. I mean, there's some studies that show if you even as much as, say, an old pizza box and a used tissue can actually make your moral judgments more harsh.
Yeah, that's right. It's crazy. So going back to the theme that just about anything can modulate people's moral judgments in these crazy sorts of ways.
Right. And so you actually have also done some work recently on disgust, not about disgust's effect on morality, but how certain moral judgments have to do with disgust. So it's like, say, moral judgments about things like incest or eating your family dog, or things that seem sort of like taboo violations, sort of function differently than other moral wrongs that have to do more with harms. So I wonder if you could talk about that too.
Yeah, that's right. So the way that I got into this work is in a conversation with Joe Henrich, an anthropologist, where I was explaining some of the work that I do on the role of intention in moral judgments, and part of the rationale there is that morality is so complicated, as we've seen. It relies on so many different cognitive systems and looks very different depending on the culture or even the individual, that I thought it makes sense to take an example rule that might apply to all of morality independent of the content of morality. So even if I don't know what you think is morally wrong, I know that what you think is wrong, you think is more wrong when it's done on purpose versus by accident. Which in our own culture would be the difference between murder and manslaughter, but it could be any arbitrary thing that is more wrong when it's done on purpose. And I was describing, again, this sort of logic for studying intentions in moral judgments. And it turns out that among anthropologists, it's understood that intentions don't matter in various hunter-gatherer cultures. And it also turned out that a lot of what's studied in those cultures are taboo violations. And so I began thinking about whether intent does matter sort of equivalently across moral domain, whether when it comes to violations of food or sex, whether intent maybe matters less. If you ate the wrong thing, if you ate pork by accident when you shouldn't, it maybe doesn't matter that you did it by accident. You have to, go through the same sorts of reparations to purify yourself, to purify your body and your soul. Same for committing incest. Just imagining committing incest, even by accident, seems pretty revolting. And so intent might matter a whole lot in cases of harm, like the cases of intentionally versus accidentally poisoning someone, as we've talked about, but maybe intent might matter less in cases of eating taboo foods or sleeping with blood relatives, and so on. So that's a hypothesis that we set out to test.
Yeah, so the basic thought there is that the reason that intention might matter in cases of harm is so if I'm looking around and trying to decide who I want to be friends with, I don't want to be friends with people that are going to intend harm to other people. That just seems like a bad idea. But in sort of taboo violations or these disgust violations, maybe the only person I'm really harming is myself. Maybe I don't really need to be on the lookout as much for who's intending what.
Right, exactly, right. So a lot of research from evolutionary psychologists and anthropologists have suggested that our disgust responses evolved initially for food rejection and pathogen avoidance to help us avoid contaminating ourselves, our own bodies. And like you said, when we're worried about negatively impacting ourselves, we maybe care less about whether we did so intentionally or accidentally. But in cases of interpersonal harms where one person's actions actually affect another person, those two could have a conversation about whether it was done by accident. Is this person going to hurt me in the future? Are they going to help me in the future? And my predictions about whether that person is going to hurt or help me in the future will depend to a great extent on what happened in the present moment and whether it was an accident or whether it happened on purpose, and all of that information about mental states.
Right. So one way of framing this, which might be a little bit silly, is that you could think that we think about sort of violations of taboo things, so like incest or having sex with my sister, much like the people, or more like the people with autism spectrum disorder think about accidental harm.
Right. Yeah, that's interesting. I hadn't thought about that spin before.
I don't know if that's the one that you should go with. I think there's an interesting connection.
We'll write a paper on that. Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I've gotten a lot of pushback from people who say that, in fact, a lot of these purity violations like incest or eating taboo foods aren't moral violations at all, and that's why intent doesn't matter. Intent matters in the cases of interpersonal harms, and interpersonal harms make up sort of canonical human morality, and the rest where intent doesn't matter, that's just fringe.
And this would be very much against the sort of view that, say, like John Haidt has put forward, that there are certain things that the sort of we good Western liberals have classified as moral things, so like harm or fairness. And then there's a whole another set of things which also that everyone else sort of thinks of as involving morality. But we've sort of said, oh no, those aren't really anything to do with real morality, and we sort of restricted what we talk about as morality.
Right. I think it's interesting. I mean, on the one hand, one approach to that could be to think up all the examples where even good, westernized liberals also think are wrong, which belong to the purity domain. So suicide might be the ultimate case of self-harm, which is considered wrong for lots of reasons, even by people in the weird cultures, right? Western, educated, industrialized, and so on.
Us,
yeah, exactly. You and me. But, another approach is to sort of concede a bit. To the extent that harm norms seem to be universal across cultures and certainly across the political divide, right? So folks like John Haidt and Jesse Graham have shown that conservatives and liberals alike place a lot of moral emphasis on harm and fairness. I think that matters. I think it matters that we seem to find harm norms all around, but maybe purity norms weighted more heavily in certain cultures. I think it matters that, anger may drive our responses to harmful violations, whereas disgust drives our responses to purity violations. I think that, it matters that disgust responses maybe evolve not for moral purposes or social purposes at all, but for something, having nothing to do with people or morality. I think that matters also in how we want to approach these different kinds of norms, and whether we want to throw some out or keep the rest, or what.
Right. So we talked about three different things, and I know there are more that we won't get to, but we talked about the role that intention plays in moral judgment, and also the role that emotion can play, and then also the role that disgust has played. And so it seems like the view that's coming out of a lot of moral psychology is that we shouldn't think of morality or moral cognition as one sort of unified thing where we could locate, this is the area of the brain that does morality, or, this is what is a moral question, and this is what isn't. But it's really a sort of, this difficult collection of lots of different processes that end up being all called moral judgments. So, is that your view, or do you think that there's still some way in which we can think of all of the things that we tend to call moral one single process?
I think I was going to say it's an open question. It's really lots of open questions, I think, for moral psychologists and social psychologists. You and I belong to this group.
Wait 1 second. This light just went off. Just don't go nowhere. Sorry, the office light went off, and then you could no longer see me. Okay, sorry.
Ready?
Yeah.
Okay. So, you and I belong to this group of researchers, and we call ourselves, the moral psychology research group, and yet there are researchers among us who don't think that morality exists, right? That there isn't anything unified like moral judgment, or that there are just too many things, and that it's not useful to call all of those things morality. We should just, study intentions, we should study emotions, we should study, and even among emotions, we should study disgust versus anger, and so on. And so I think it's curious that at the same time we want to call ourselves moral psychologists, because then what are we studying? For me, I think it's an open question as to whether there will be anything that defines morality proper. I mean, we can speculate about what morality might mean across content areas, right? Across harm, across purity, across different kinds of dependent measures, like how wrong something is, how punishable something is, how blameworthy someone is. I take what we are studying to be something like the things that we want to punish other people for, the things that we base our decisions about friendships on, who we want to affiliate with, who we trust, who we define as part of our group, our in-group, and so on. And of course, there are lots of other things that go into these kinds of judgments that may not have anything to do with morality, but I don't know that that means that something like morality doesn't exist. And I think that, we can go back to the developmental psychologists who, again, are among the early moral psychologists in trying to define a boundary between social conventional violations on the one hand and properly moral violations on the other. And while that set of views has, been under attack recently, I think that there's something there about, moral norms are norms that we take to be universal. They're a little bit more like facts versus preferences. They're a little bit more objective versus subjective. I think I can punish you if you break a moral rule, but perhaps not so much if you break a conventional rule. Maybe they're more serious. Maybe, even if the relevant authority figure says it's okay to hit someone, I still think it's not okay, because hitting someone belongs to the moral domain as opposed to another domain, a domain of social convention and so on. And
right.
I
so
think
it
we're
seems
still
like there
working
are
on
two sort
the
of
details.
tightly connected questions. One is the question about, what should we properly call moral? And that has to do with this moral conventional distinction. And the other one is just we can sort of use neuroscience or use different psychological methods to look at So what are the cognitive processes that are involved in certain moral judgments? And then it seems like those two have this interesting relation. So if we find, say, if we end up being able to sort of dissect, well, we thought these things were all one sort of moral judgment, but it turns out that there's two separate cognitive processes which explain them, and they explain them in different ways, and they have these different features. And maybe we'll end up saying, okay, we have to make this further division amongst things that we thought were obviously moral. And then you could sort of have this back and forth between both the question of, what do we think of as moral psychologists, and what are the cognitive processes that are involved in making these moral judgments?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think it'll be interesting to see whether all of those processes that people are studying interact with it in a unique sort of way to generate what becomes a moral judgment. So I think that, we're on the same page to the extent that we all agree that a lot of different cognitive processes contribute to the process of moral judgment, but what's an open question is whether those processes interact in a uniquely moral sort of way to generate our moral judgments, and what would be the right sorts of signatures, whether at the neural level or the behavioral level, of a uniquely moral judgment.
Yeah, that seems right. So I wanted to end with one question. So I know recently you've written and thought a little bit about whether the morality's role in evolution. So what parts of our nature, our human nature, that we now have, do we have because of moral questions in our evolutionary past? And so one of the things that I think you've thought at least a little bit about is that, does our ability to read other people's intentions or their false beliefs or things like that, in our evolutionary past, do we evolve that specifically to solve certain moral questions?
Right. So, I guess there's a controversial way to put it, which would be that all of mental state reasoning is for moral reasoning. But when you break down the pieces, I think that some of this makes a lot of sense, which is that we don't necessarily need to read other people's minds unless it's to predict what they're going to do or to explain what they did to us or to people that we know, or to make evaluations of whether, again, they're friend or foe, and whether they're going to help or hurt us now or in the future. And so I think to that extent, mind reading or mentalizing, whatever you want to call it, serves social interaction and serves moral evaluation to a large extent.
Right, yeah. So I think, it's obviously going to be very hard at this point to come up with an answer to the evolutionary question. But it's definitely an interesting one to consider. And it seems like the opposing view would be something like, well, the reason that we evolved mental state reasoning or theory of mind was that we needed to be able to coordinate in some sort of way. So suppose, we plan to meet at Boston College to discuss some new findings in moral psychology. And you tell me, well, just come to Boston College and we can meet there. But you also know that I'm really confused about the Boston College and what it is and where it is, and that I have this false belief that Boston College is actually just part of Harvard University. And so you can actually reason, given my false belief, and you can actually just go to Harvard University to meet me, or you could sort of get in touch with me and be like, I don't think you should go to Harvard. Boston College is the same.
This could happen on Thursday when we meet up, Jonathan.
This could, in fact, happen on Thursday.
Right. So I think that what I've been doing is lumping coordination in the package of social interaction and moral evaluation, right? So coordinating with individuals, either at an interpersonal level or at a group level, I think gets bound up with moral cognition. So again, the people that you affiliate with are the people who are part of your in-group and share morals and values with. So I guess what I don't mean to say is that mental state reasoning serves moral evaluation narrowly construed. So mental evaluation is only for judging whether people are good or bad and so on, but more broadly for coordinating with people, for forming groups, for forming relationships, and for moral cognition, more generously defined.
Yeah. So, it seems like that the evolutionary question is, I think it's a fun argument, and I think it's good, and I think it's really interesting. Maybe we won't end up finding a definite answer to it in the end. But it seems like one thing that you've clearly shown is that the mental state reasoning just plays a huge role in our moral judgment.
Yes, it does.
Okay, and with that, it was great talking to you.
Thanks so much, Jonathan.
Yeah,
really
okay.
appreciate it.
Talk to you soon.
All right, see you later.